Ever feel like the resources and advice out there for women are missing something essential? I thought so too, which is why I created She Said, She Said. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. Making a real impact takes more than just passion. It takes the right mindset, the right skills, the right investments, and the right community. On this show, we dive deep. We uncover the secrets to building influence, navigating tricky relationships, and staying true to ourselves even when it's tough. I also throw in my own favorite productivity and life hacks, things that have shifted my perspective and might help you too. Wherever you are in your journey, my goal here is to leave you inspired to define success your way and to help you build the confidence you need to tackle your biggest goals. Subscribe today and let's unlock your full potential, your confidence, and your greatest influence. Hey friend, welcome to the podcast. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan, and I'm really glad to have you here. So a couple of things before we get started this morning. This is not the podcast that I was planning to record. In fact, the events over the course of the last few days really made me pivot to share something that I think hopefully will be even more useful to you. I'm going to save the episode that I was thinking about sharing until another day, because I had so many thoughts, in fact, and as I sat down to kind of capture them, I decided that I wanted to talk about this today. So I hope that you find this helpful. So I want to start by saying something very clearly. I denounce in the strongest possible terms the murder of Charlie Kirk. My heart literally breaks for his sweet family, and they continue to be in my heart and in my prayers, as does this country, which continues to be in my prayers as well. No matter our politics or our personal views, there is no justification for political violence like this. And while I realize that the facts of exactly what happened and who the assailant was and what that person's motives were is still not entirely clear. At the point of this recording, I don't believe that person has been apprehended. That will probably not be the case as soon as this airs. So, bear that in mind as you're listening to this. But the bottom line is this: disagreement is part of a free democracy and violence is not. And this episode, today's episode, is not specifically focused on this horrible tragedy. And it's not focused on the state of our politics. There are lots of other places that you can turn to for that kind of coverage and analysis. What I want to do here is something a little different. I want to reflect with you on how we can navigate really dark moments like this, which happens alongside the anniversary of 9/11. The world feels especially heavy right now. Every year, this date, September 11th, pulls us back into those memories and those feelings of deep, deep loss that we felt on 9/11. Those of us that were here in D.C. carry such vivid memories of where we were that day, a lot like those who experienced the tragedy in New York at the World Trade Towers. It is impossible not to feel the weight of those experiences, and they really do feel even heavier this year given the news of the last few days. And to be really clear, I would be the first to admit that I do not have all of the answers for how to process moments like this, quite the opposite. And like many of you, I imagine, I wrestle with how to hold on to hope, how to resist cynicism, and how to keep showing up in ways that build connection rather than fracture it. How do I role model for my children in ways that will be helpful to them? So, friend, in the interest of speaking out about what I believe matters, especially in times like this, I sat down to reflect on a few practices that have helped me in seasons of loss or seasons where I was really challenged to continue to feel hope, where I felt so much uncertainty and so much fear. And of course, if you're a listener already to She Said podcast, my guess is that you practice many of these things already. But if you're anything like me, some reminders are often a good thing. So what follows in this episode is not a prescription or a step-by-step formula. What it is a collection of practices that I personally return to again and again, along with my faith. And it's not because I always get these things right, but it's because they work when I do, and it is worth the effort to kind of keep them as part of my regular toolkit. And I hope that you find these helpful as well. The first is reframing as a path to resilience. And what I mean by that is that when the world feels especially dark, as I think it does right at this moment, one of the first things that I try to do is to reframe the story that I'm telling myself. And to be clear, that does not mean denying what has happened or pretending that everything is okay. It isn't. But it does mean trying to begin to look for maybe bigger and more helpful perspective. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. On September 11th, alongside all of the horror and the loss, there were also countless stories of extraordinary courage, of first responders rushing into burning towers and strangers carrying each other down smoke-filled stairways, and communities opening their doors to people who couldn't get home, and just so many stories like that. And those stories didn't erase the pain, but they reminded us that light can and does ultimately break through. And so resilience isn't about being unshaken. It's about trying to ask maybe what else is true here? What might I be overlooking that could help me carry this differently? And, it's hard to remember to ask that in the moment, but when I do, I find that it makes a real difference. And when Charlie Kirk was shot a few days ago, on social media several hours after the event, I was watching to see how people were responding. And there was plenty to be very troubled by. But back to this point of focusing on what was good, I saw responses and condemnation of his murder by people on both sides of the political aisle. And that gave me hope. We have a lot of work to do as a country, to be sure. But in moments like this, I found that to be comforting, frankly. Another practice is trying to move from the grief process into the meaning process. And honestly, I think it's probably a bit too soon for this, frankly. But it's to think about something that I read that was written by Viktor Frankl, who of course survived Auschwitz and wrote those in one of my favorite books, which is called Man's Search for Meaning. And he wrote that we can endure almost anything if we believe that it has meaning. And, in my study of positive psychology, the research also echoes this. When people can connect their pain to a purpose, they can ultimately recover more fully. And that does not mean rushing into a lot of silver linings. It means instead gently asking the important questions: what can I learn from this moment about what matters most? How might I live differently in honor of those that we've lost? What story do I want my children and my community to tell about how I showed up? Friend, I don't have clear answers here, but even asking these types of questions, honestly, it helps shift me from that point of paralysis into one that's focused more on purpose. And again, timing matters here. I think it's too soon. But to begin to think along these lines can be really helpful. Another tool is to choose connection despite differences. And honestly, this is probably the hardest one, especially right now. When violence is tied to our politics, our instinct can be to retreat into our corners, to harden our views, and to ultimately demonize the other side. But deep down, I know that's not who I want to be. It can be easy to fall into that trap, however. We already know that relationships are absolutely essential for well-being, and that does not mean just relationships that are in our echo chambers. It means practicing empathy and curiosity, and even, maybe especially, with those people that we disagree with. And there are a few things that I have found really helpful here. The first is listening with the goal of understanding rather than persuading. And boy, oh boy, is this hard. The second is looking for some shared human values, safety, dignity, hope for our children, values that cut across party lines, things that we should all agree with. And then choosing respect, even when it isn't reciprocated, and that is incredibly difficult. I fail at this, honestly, more often than I would like to admit. But when I do get it right, even in small ways, it feels like an act of resistance against a culture of contempt. And that gives me great hope, and it helps me to face another day. The next tool relates to gratitude and how it can be a counterweight to so much darkness. Gratitude can feel both sort of weirdly misplaced in the face of tragedy. But to be clear, it's not about pretending that everything is okay. Instead, it is about noticing what still is okay. And after 9/11, I remember people telling stories about the small twists of fate that had spared them. A delayed train, a child's forgotten lunchbox, maybe a conversation that kept them from arriving at the wrong place at the wrong time. Gratitude doesn't erase grief, but it can live alongside it. And for me, I adopted some time ago a practice that I engage in most every day. I do it as often as I possibly can. And it is to reflect on and even write down 3 small things that I'm grateful for at the end of each day. And this is really, really simple, but it can be so powerful. And frankly, the scientific research actually backs up the power of this particular process. Oftentimes, these are things for me that are like really small, and I often include them in my nightly prayers as well. As I am thanking God for the gift of another day, I also incorporate other things that I'm thankful for that day. Maybe something great that happened with my children or to one of my children, or something that didn't happen that I'm really grateful for, that things worked out better. Maybe it was a near miss auto accident, or, it could be just anything. And it could be something really small, like an incredibly great cup of coffee or a text from a friend, or, some kind words from someone. The point is, and the trick here is really learning to notice those things that can remind us, even in the darkest moments and the darkest days, that goodness still persists. And it's a matter of sort of shifting your mindset into one of gratitude. Again, it can be so difficult when everything feels so dark, but it can provide a pathway to find a lot more light. The next tool is about cultivating hope like a muscle. And hope isn't just that feeling that floats in when life is good. It is actually something that we build like a muscle. And a psychologist, Charles Snyder, actually described hope as a combination of believing that the future can be better and believing that there are pathways to help get you there. And so, some days hope feels like incredibly hard work. But even imagining a future where things can change is in itself an act of defiance against despair. And some 24 years after 9/11, I've seen hope at work in the families who've built memorials, in the children, many of whom who didn't have a chance to know one of their parents perhaps, who've grown into adults and carried forward their parents' legacies, in communities that gather every year to remember and to recommit. Those acts remind me that hope is less about optimism and more about discipline. And honestly, it's really about both, but it is underscoring the fact that it's a muscle and it takes practice and it's something that you have to do. So in closing, friend, I just want to offer a few practical reminders. Some things that, if you're wondering maybe what this could look like in your own life, here are some practices that I keep coming back to. Reframing a negative thought. When you catch yourself in a spiral, in a negative downward spiral, ask yourself what else might be true. The second one is pause before responding. When you find yourself triggered, breathe and name that feeling that you're feeling, and then give yourself a window before you react. Maybe even write down what that response might be and reflect on that before you actually deliver it, if you decide to deliver it at all. Honor your grief and then ask, therefore what? By doing that, you can ritualize remembrance and then decide what action you might want to take in response. Then another one, which I think is really hard, is to state your opponent's argument as clearly and strongly as you can before you decide to disagree. And one of the most important things I think we can do in this moment is to set a time limit on your media diet. If you're watching a lot of cable news, if you're spending a lot of time on social media, just be aware and maybe set a timer so that you're balancing time time on media, time watching television, time on social media against some of these practices. And then write down those 3 good things and maybe one next step, that gratitude plus agency, which can really be effective when you practice this at building up hope. Friend, I certainly do not manage to do all of these things as well as I would hope every single day. But here's the thing, when I do notice that my heart feels lighter, my thinking is clearer, and I believe firmly that my influence is also stronger. So in closing, when we think about the hijackers on 9/11, they chose violence over discourse. And whoever killed Charlie Kirk likely did the same thing. And both those acts reject persuasion, they reject dignity, and they reject firmly the shared project of democracy. The challenge for us is not to mirror that rejection, but to keep choosing the harder path, to grieve honestly, to find meaning, to practice curiosity, to try to live with gratitude, and to really work hard to cultivate hope. Again, like I said, I don't always succeed, but I believe these choices, those small, daily, imperfect choices, really matter. And they shape not only the lives that we live, but also the civic fabric that allows us to live together in freedom, even when we disagree. So if you take nothing else away from this reflection, I hope that it's this. We don't need to have all the answers. We don't need to get it right every time, but we can keep showing up with humility, with curiosity, and with influence instead of force. And that in itself is a kind of light. Friend, God be with you. I hope you found this week's episode helpful. I would love, as always, to hear your feedback, so please send it along. In the meantime, remember, She Said, She Said podcast is a weekly production of She Said, She Said Media. Take care, and I'll see you again next week.